What I plan to do is talk first a little bit of introduction about human salt taste, taste qualities, and taste mechanisms. This will be a very high level, no details. Uh, Mention, of course, the necessity for reducing salt intake in the U.S. And then I want to just make about 6 different uh, aspects of why it is that probably from a sensory point of view, it is so difficult to reduce the amount of salt consumed, certainly in the population and of course for the individual. So I start with the human taste qualities, and these qualities are found, go back thousands of years, and there's a strong agreement that there's 5 primary taste qualities: sweet, salty, umami, sour, and bitter, and that they're there through evolution to solve really important issues of consuming sufficient calories, sufficient protein, and avoiding bitter or toxic poisons. And so these are fundamental parts of our biology. And for example, sweet taste is built in, and we like it because that is what animals like to be able to detect calories. And salty exists presumably because sodium is so important to the body. We have to have a mechanism by which we can recognize it, because in the world of animals that eat plants or even are omnivores, there's a real necessity to be able to detect sodium because it's absolutely required for life. So obviously, the reason we're here is because of concern about excess intake. And I just put two little quotes up about from a recent Nature review on nephrology. And I want to emphasize the second one, where the authors note that globally, the average daily salt intake of 10 to 15 grams of sodium chloride far exceeds physiological requirements of the World Health Organization, where less than 5 grams of salt per day is recommended. I will try to use the grams of salt as the discussion, but there's times when we talk about sodium. But basically, I want to keep on all of us on the same page with talking about how much salt people consume and where it comes from. This is a figure that probably almost everybody has seen 1,000 times, which is the demonstration that in our culture, salt is in everything. Salt is everywhere. It's in all kinds of foods, many of which we don't even feel are salty. And as a consequence, if we are going to reduce salt in the population, one is going to have to reduce the amount of in all these foods. And in the US, as again, I'm sure all of you know, most of the salt consumed is consumed from manufactured food. That is food that's purchased in grocery stores or in restaurants or what have you. And the estimate is about 80% comes from that source. And so it's very, very difficult to reduce it. And in the olden days, when I was first studying salt, people kept talking about getting rid of the salt shaker, but that really won't help much in our culture for the average person. This is one of my favorite cartoons, which is, I guess, indicative of the view that excess salt is a danger to the individual and to the population. So let me just talk a little bit about how salt taste works. And again, I'm going to be very simple-minded here. So here's the human tongue. We have taste buds on the tongue. We also have taste buds way in the back and in the palate. And interestingly enough, there's taste receptors and taste buds throughout the body, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the conscious perception of taste, which begins with the taste receptors on the tongue. So this is a cartoon of a taste bud. And what we believe now is that taste buds have taste cells, and in each bud, there may be a mixture of cells, some responsive to salt, some to sweet, some to sour, some to bitter, and some to umami. And then these detect the stimuli and pass this down to the brain, which I'm not going to talk anything about how the brain analyzes this, but this is the presumed mechanism by which we detect these basic tastes. I should say that these taste receptors can detect other compounds as well, but from the perceptual point of view, the major sensory response to taste is these 5 basic tastes. So there are 2 major types of taste receptors, which I've shown here. One, the GPCRs are, if you can kind of think of a lock and key mechanism, where the compounds, the molecules that elicit the taste are able to be detected by a receptor that's kind of like a lock and key. But this is a little bit different in that the variety of different kinds of keys could go into the lock. The one on the left, the ion channel, is very, very different. Here, the tastant, and we believe this is how salt works, the tastant does not go into a sort of a lock and key situation, but literally goes through a channel or a hole inside the cell. And this is very, very specific for salt. And as a consequence, as we'll see, there are very few compounds that actually are salty. This is another picture of this channel. It was finally published in 2009, and this is clearly one of the major taste receptors, but it's not the only one. There are other, maybe less specific salt taste mechanisms which appear to exist. And amazingly, given what we know about so many other things, we're not sure exactly what these mechanisms are yet, even yet. There are several candidates, but and this is an area that we at Monell and many other places are working to try to understand what are all of the mechanisms underlying salt taste. But the taste channel is probably the most important. So now I want to move to these 6 characteristics of taste that may compromise our ability to successfully reduce sodium in the population. First of all, it's widely believed, although it's difficult to prove, that there's an innate component to our liking for salt. And one reason that we believe that is because the many animal studies have shown that at the moment that an animal becomes salt deficient, it recognizes what it needs by taste, and it needs no experience to do that. So that's called salt appetite, and it's found in many plant-eating animals, and it's, however, very unusual in humans. It's in the general population, almost nobody is salt depleted. You may feel like you are, you may desire salt, but in terms of the body's physiology, humans are remarkably good at conserving salt. So salt taste, salt appetite in the sense of this tremendous desire to get salt is seen only in certain medical conditions. However, there is a salt preference, which is a bit different. And it's also true that many species like salt even when they're not depleted. Certainly humans do. And so most of our interest in salt consumption and trying to reduce it is about salt preferences and how these might be modified. So one reason we think that some tastes are innately responsive, responded to, is from facial expressions. And this is a newborn infant showing a positive, they claim it's a smile. I don't think it's that, but it's kind of a relaxation and a sucking desire for sweets. And this is a photograph. We've done studies on premature babies showing that they respond to sugar at the very first time that they've ever had anything prior to feeding. And this is a response to the opposite, the bitter taste. Clearly, this is a strong response, again, to an infant that has had no earlier experience. This is a response of an infant to salt, and as far as we can tell, this is unresponsive. This is the same way the infant would respond to plain water. And so there's no evidence that at birth infants have a preference for salty substances. We've studied this in infants at different ages, and one of the interesting results of this is a demonstration of salt taste preference sort of developing at about 4 months of age. So on the left here is three substances that the babies are given to suck on. One is water, the other is a low concentration of salt, the second is a concentration 0.2 molar, which is about the level that would be found in commercial soups, for example. And as you can see, early on, there's no difference in response to these three substances. But by the age of 4 months, there's a clear preference for and a liking for salt. There are reasons to believe that, this change is due to a maturation of the salt taste receptor, and therefore reflects a kind of innate response that doesn't develop until about 4 months. But we do know also that dietary experience alters the liking for salt, and this is a kind of a difficult graph to explain, but basically what it shows is that children who are fed starchy table foods for the first months in life exhibit a high preference for salt. And if you would just look on the right side, at the age of 2 months, as we showed before, there's no particular preference for salt, but those infants that had been exposed to salty, starchy table foods show a very large preference. That's the red going up, whereas those that hadn't been exposed show, again, still show no preference. And I want to point out something here that we'll see in just a moment, which is the concentrations of salt. And down at the bottom on the far right of the graph, 0.34 molar salt is very, very salty. Again, it's about twice the level of typical soup, and yet these young children tend to have a strong preference for this. Here's another example of that. This is studies in 3 to 5 year old children. And on the left is their response to salt water, which of course we don't consume on almost any circumstance. And on the right is the same concentrations of salt in a clear soup. And these children by now respond just the way we would do. That is, that they reject the consumption, the percent preference for salty water, but they love salt when it's in a soup background. And again, notice that the concentration of 0.34 molar, which is very, very salty, is their preferred level, much, much higher than is commercially available. But we can look at adults and demonstrate that their response to salt is modified by experience. And this is obviously an anecdote, but it's a wonderful one, where Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels describes going to a country that has a very low salt diet. And when he gets to that country, he finds that he can't stand the food. It's bland. He doesn't like it. He almost can't get it down. But after a while, he gets used to it, and after a while, everything is fine. And then finally, he goes back to the country that he came from, and everything is way too salty. And so this is obviously just an anecdote, but there are a lot of other anecdotes suggesting that one can modify how much people like salt based on their experience with salt. And this is the first study we did many, many years ago that demonstrated this experimentally. We're proving what Gulliver knew 200 years earlier. So if you just look on the right side, the experimental side, we have two curves. One curve is testing people's response to how much they like salt in crackers, and the amount of salt is in grams on the bottom of those curves. And if one looks at the before they began a low salt diet, one sees that their optimal level of salt was quite high. It was actually the highest we gave them. But after 2 to 3 months, that moved down, and by 2 to 3 months, their preferred level of salt was much lower, and the high concentrations were not liked at all. And this is really the experimental demonstration of what Gulliver was talking about. And this has now been shown by a number of people. It's widely believed to be true. We got no one paper is going to prove anything, but if there's a consensus, which there is for this, it seems to be a profound effect. And based on that, in part, CDC and FDA have recommended, and the Institute of Medicine formalized these recommendations to what the U.S. diet should do is to the food industry should do is reduce sodium gradually in manufactured foods. And if this was done over time, and the time is not specified how much it would be, people would, the whole population could be brought down to be liking and consuming a lower level of salt. The attempts to do this, of course, other people will talk about. It's very difficult, but this is the theory that we should be able to reduce the amount of salt by gradually reducing it, and people wouldn't mind it because they would adapt to the lower levels. However, it's also the case, and this is kind of ignored, that you can go the other way. And so it's possible, and there's a couple of studies that show this, to increase salt intake and therefore increase preference and move away from liking less salt. Now, I mentioned age-related differences in liking for salt, but I want to emphasize them again because this is a remarkable difference between children and adults. Here's a study, again, that we did many, many years ago, where we looked at adults and preschool children and measured their optimal level of salt in soup. The curve on the left, the red one, is adults, and lo and behold, the level at which we found the people liking salt was about what the commercial salt level was at the time. And on the right, you see again preschool children showing a remarkably strong preference for high salt. 40 years later, one of my colleagues did exactly the same study again, and this is on the right. You can see where I've circled it in black, and the results are identical. That the adults prefer about the same level of salt as found in commercial foods, whereas the children show a very strong preference for salt. So it's going to be important to think about how you feed younger children, because they seem, for reasons that we don't understand, to have a high preference for salt. It's been suggested maybe it has something to do with growing, that the sodium need is different. We don't know why it is, but it looks like it's very, very consistent across studies and even across cultures. If we look at the other end of the age range, older adults may perceive salt as less intense than younger adults, and as a consequence may also tend to prefer higher salt levels. And this is one recent study that suggested that. This is a time intensity evaluation of salt. So they're looking at salt again over 10 seconds. If you just look at the right side, it's easiest to see that the ability to detect salt and the intensity of salt in older people never grows as strong as the ability of younger people. And it may be that they lose their ability to to taste it, and so consequently they may need more to reach the optimal levels for foods. And so I think one has to look particularly at the older people as maybe having a different salt world than the average middle-aged people. Probably, though, the most potent effect of salt in terms of its power to drive intake is its ability to modify other tastes and flavors. So I love this quote: "Salt is the general of foods," and anybody that looks at recipes knows just the potency of salt in virtually every recipe. This is, again, an old study by Marianne Gillette at McCormick, but it is, I think, the most beautiful salt study ever done. So what Marianne did was to study people's judgments of salted and unsalted soups, and the gray is the unsalted, the blue is the salted, and this spider plot I think everybody is probably familiar with. The distance between that red dot and the comparable blue or gray dots, it says how different they are. And basically, if you look at that red dot and go over to saltiness, you see obviously if you add salt, it makes it saltier. But notice that it tends to make it sweeter, it tends to increase thickness, it tends to increase fullness, flavor strength, balance, whatever that is, and reduces bitter and metallic. In other words, it makes a profound positive effect on it's not just saltiness, it's making it better. We studied this in a much more simple way, looking at salt's interaction with bitter, and there's good evidence to suggest that salt, and particularly the sodium part of salt, is able to modify the receptor such that it is inhibiting bitter taste. And we know for a variety of reasons, although we don't know the exact mechanism, that this is at the level of the bitter receptor. So if one looks at salt inhibiting bitterness, these are a group of bitter compounds. Some of them are inhibited more than others, and I'm going to talk about the one right in the middle there, urea, which is profoundly suppressed by salt. And again, this is the sodium part of salt, and it's at the receptor level. So what we demonstrated again a number of years ago is that by adding salt, therefore, to a mixture of bitter and sweet, one can actually make that mixture sweeter. And if you look at the left bar, that's the sweetness of sucrose. At the middle bar, the red one, that's the bitterness of urea. When those two are mixed together at the same molar concentrations they were in the first two bars, they suppress each other, and this part of suppression is probably going on in the brain. But if you add salt to it, what you do is you suppress the bitterness, that releases the sweetness from suppression and makes the whole thing sweeter. So this is, I think, just one kind of mechanism by which salt can modify foods in ways that are distinctive to particular foods and particular cuisines. Now, one obviously hope is that one could come up with a salt substitute that would be sodium free, presuming sodium is the thing we want to reduce. And I think that that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. If we look again at the receptor, and I remind you about how the receptors differ and how specific the salt receptor is, and this is illustrated in the next slide, which if we look and compare with sweeteners, these are compounds all sweet, some are obviously bitter and sweet, some are off sweet, but many compounds are sweet, some natural, some not. But if you look at the primarily salty substances, very few things are sweet. And I think this is consistent with the idea that this salt taste receptor, the ENaC, the channel, is very specific to the sodium, the lithium ion, they're obviously similar. And KCl is an interesting point, which I don't have time to discuss, but we don't really understand why KCl is salty, but it's also for many people bitter or unpleasant. It's not bitter, it's bad. But so in my judgment, we are never going to find an aspartame of salt. It just won't exist because of the mechanism of reception. However, that channel can be influenced by something that might enhance salt taste, and this is an example from some of my colleagues demonstrating that there is, at least in theory, the possibility of developing, and in practice now, enhancers for salt, so that the same level of salt can be made to taste saltier by adding something that itself is not salty. And that's what this shows, that L-arginine HCl added to low levels of salt increase the saltiness. But it only works at low levels, unfortunately. The last
Gary,
thing
I just want to give you a 2-minute time check.
The last thing I want to mention is something that's not a sensory thing, but I think is worth talking about, at least thinking about. And this is, if you remember, I said the average, I quoted somebody, the average amount of salt consumed is 8 to 12 or 15 grams a day. If one looks back at across cultures, one finds that this number comes up time and time again. And here's the oldest known estimate, and it's very, very rough, but it comes out 300 BC to 7.5 grams of salt per day. Here's some other estimates. Again, these are very, very rough, but again, are remarkable about the same levels of salt in these cultures that are independent and very, very old. Here's a nicer study, much more recent, but still old, looking at a variety of different cultures. And this is used to show that cultures where people consume very low sodium, they have very little hypertension. But my interest is on the far right, that most of the cultures that were looked at consume, again, about the same amount of salt. Now we think about this slide again, and that most of the salt comes from, in the US, a wide variety of foods. And the concern is, of course, that somehow we can't get away from it. But is there something else driving how much salt we consume? And these are some data I just recently took from a paper. Along the bottom level is the percent of discretionary salt consumed. That is the percent for these various countries all over the world. The percent of the salt consumed by an individual is added by the person at the table or cooking or whatever. In other words, it's not like in the US, it's not bought. Whereas in the US, we can see that the percent discretionary salt, and I've got it indicated there, is very low, whereas in India, it's very high. And on the vertical axis is the amount of salt consumed. And I can't attest that these are good estimates of salt intake per country. But what you can see is that the percent discretionary salt is actually consumes more salt than in the USA, where where the percent is very, very low. So it's hard to argue that the reason we're consuming so much salt is because of the way that salt is presented to us in all our foods. I'm going to skip this slide. So we don't know the basis for this relatively constant amount of salt consumed, but it's curious and I think worth looking at, because it may be that there's something about driving this level that we as yet physiologically don't understand. So my overall conclusions, leaving out that last very speculative issue, is that indeed population-wide reductions of salt will enhance health and save lives. In cultures like ours, obviously, the strategy has to be reducing it in the manufactured foods, But in cultures where they're still consuming as much salt as we consume or more, but it's being added at home or by the cook, very different strategies have to be used, and this has to be kept in mind. And I believe that the myriad mechanisms and functions of salt in food makes this population-wide reduction particularly challenging. Thank you very much.